It was a Friday night, and Sarah's office was empty. She was known for her dedicated work and had decided to finish an important project before the weekend. Fluorescent lights buzzed above her, creating a spooky atmosphere in the deserted hallway. As Sarah frantically typed on her keyboard, the clock on the wall continued to tick. The hours dragged by, and she lost track of time. When he finally finished, he looked at the clock and saw that it was already past midnight. Exhausted and anxious to go home, she turned off her computer and grabbed her bag. Most of his colleagues had already left, and the building was silent. Sarah walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and waited patiently. As she waited, she felt a strange sensation that she was being watched. Her heart started to beat a little faster, and she looked around the hallway, but saw no one. Only the pale light of the lamps illuminated the empty space. The elevator doors opened, and Sarah entered. It was an ordinary elevator, with stainless steel walls and a mirror on the side opposite the doors. She pressed the downstairs button and waited for the doors to close. As the elevator began to slowly move downward, Sarah tried to calm her nerves. The feeling of being watched still bothered her, but she decided it was just her imagination. After all, I was tired and stressed after a long night of work. The elevator continued to descend, and Sarah looked at her reflection in the mirror. She looked pale and tired, with dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was messy, and she wondered why she had put so much effort into this project. That's when she heard something strange. A soft, almost inaudible sound, like distant laughter. Sarah frowned and looked around the elevator, but she was alone. The laughter continued, growing in intensity and turning into ghoulish laughter. Sarah's heart began to beat faster, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She pressed the elevator buttons repeatedly, trying to stop it, but nothing worked. The elevator continued to descend, and sinister laughter echoed through the confined space. Panic took over her, and she began to feel that something was terribly wrong. She screamed, asking for someone to help her, but there was no one to hear. The laughter continued, increasingly disturbing. Finally, the elevator stopped. The doors opened to reveal a bizarre scene. Sarah was in a narrow, dark hallway, lit only by candles burning in iron holders on the walls. The air was filled with an acrid, ancient smell. With shaking hands, Sarah tried to exit the elevator, but the doors closed abruptly behind her, trapping her in the shadowy hallway. The candles seemed to move on their own, creating dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah began walking down the hallway, her rapid breathing echoing in the oppressive silence. She could hear voices whispering around her, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all around her. Her footsteps echoed on the cold stone floor, and she felt like she was in a nightmare. Sarah continued to walk down the dark hallway, the candles casting distorted shadows her way. The whispering voices around him seemed clearer and clearer, as if they were trying to communicate something, but their words were incomprehensible. The hallway seemed endless, and Sarah began to doubt her own sanity. The acrid smell of the candles made her feel nauseous, and the oppressive silence made her feel like she was in a world apart. Finally, she arrived at a large wooden door at the end of the hallway. It was ajar, and a faint light shone from within. Sarah approached the door cautiously and peered inside. What she saw left her astonished. She was in a large, decaying room with tables covered in dirty cloth arranged in rows. Rusty candelabras hung from the ceiling, and candles burned in them, creating a dim, flickering light. But what disturbed her most were the shadowy figures that filled the hall. They were dark silhouettes, standing around the tables, as if they were participating in a mysterious party. Sarah could hear muffled laughter and whispering murmurs, but she could not see the faces of the figures. They seemed oblivious to Sarah's presence, but she felt they were watching her with invisible eyes. Sarah backed away slowly, afraid of what might happen next. She turned to leave, but the wooden door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the hall. Panic gripped her as the shadowy figures began to approach. She tried to scream, asking to be released, but her voice was drowned out by the whispering laughter of the figures. Sarah looked around for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped in the decaying hall, at the mercy of the approaching shadows. The shadowy figures were getting closer, their laughter turning into menacing murmurs. Sarah felt overwhelming fear as she backed away, but there was no escape. She was trapped in a surreal nightmare, not knowing how she got there or how she would get out. Desperately, Sarah tried to remember how she got to the salon. She remembered the narrow hallway, the candles, the whispering voices. She knew the answer was somewhere inside her mind, but she was so confused and terrified that she could barely think. The shadowy figures were almost reaching her, their hands reaching towards her. Sarah closed her eyes tightly, trying to block out the frightening silhouettes approaching. It was then that something extraordinary happened. A memory appeared in his mind, like a flash of light in the darkness. She remembered pressing the elevator button, hearing the sinister laughter, being transported to that macabre place. With determination, Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the shadowy figures. She didn't know what they were or why they were there, but she knew she needed to find a way to get back to the elevator and escape this nightmare. She stepped forward, facing the shadows with courage. She knew she couldn't allow fear to dominate her. With determination, he began running in the direction he had come from, hoping to find an exit and return to the elevator. She didn't know what awaited her in the dark corridor, but she was willing to face anything to escape this lofty nightmare. Sarah ran down the dark hallway, her heart hammering in her chest as the shadowy figures continued to follow her, their whispering murmurs echoing in her ears. She was determined to find a way out and get back to the elevator, no matter what was waiting for her in the eerie hallway. The darkness was suffocating, and the candles burning in iron holders on the walls cast dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Sarah continued to run, ignoring the feeling that the corridor was stretching infinitely. Finally, she spotted a half-open door to her right. Without hesitation, she entered, hoping this would be the exit she so desperately wanted. She found herself in a dark, dusty room, lit only by a single candle that flickered on a table. Still panting, Sarah scanned the room. There was a large bed with faded curtains, an antique mirror, and a wardrobe that seemed to have been forgotten by time. She approached the window and tried to open it, but it was stuck, as if it didn't want her to escape. As Sarah tried to find a way out of the room, she heard a sound coming from the wardrobe. It was a soft whisper, barely audible, but it was there. She cautiously approached the wardrobe and opened the door. What she saw inside made her scream in horror. It was a shadowy figure, cowering inside the wardrobe. It was like the other figures she had seen, dark and indistinct, with empty eyes that stared at her. The figure extended a pale hand towards her, as if asking for help. Sarah quickly backed away and closed the wardrobe door. She was even more determined to find a way out and escape that terrifying place. She didn't know what that shadowy figure was or why she was trapped there, but she knew she couldn't help it. Continuing her search for a way out, Sarah left the room and returned to the dark hallway. She was determined to find a way to get back to the elevator and out of this nightmare. As she ran down the hall, she heard a familiar sound. It was the sinister laughter that had haunted her since she entered the elevator. They seemed to get closer, as if something was approaching her. Sarah ran even faster, her breathing quickening and her heart beating wildly. She knew she couldn't allow the shadows to reach her. She had to find a way out before it was too late. Finally, she saw the elevator door in front of her. With a sigh of relief, she ran towards it and pressed the downstairs button. The elevator doors opened immediately, as if they had been waiting for her. Sarah entered the elevator and pressed the ground floor button once again. The elevator started to move, and she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She was finally escaping this nightmare, but she knew she wasn't completely safe yet. As the elevator rose, Sarah tried to understand what had happened. She couldn't explain the shadowy figures, the sinister whispers, and the macabre laughter. Everything felt surreal, like it was a nightmare she was finally waking up from. When the elevator doors opened again, Sarah was back on the ground floor of the office building, as if nothing had happened. She got out of the elevator and ran into the street, leaving behind the nightmare she had lived. Sarah never knew what really happened that night in the elevator. She couldn't explain the frightening visions, the unsettling whispers, or the shadowy figures that haunted her. She wondered if it had all been just a delusion, a product of her imagination overwhelmed by stress and fatigue. But whatever it was, the experience left deep scars on his mind. She never looked at an elevator the same way again, and every dark night was haunted by the feeling that terror could lurk in the most ordinary places, even in a silent elevator at night. Sarah left the office building that night, leaving the elevator and the nightmare she had lived behind. She was relieved to be back to reality, but fear still haunted her. She knew she would never forget that terrifying experience, even if she couldn't fully explain what had happened. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to resume her normal life. She went back to work, met friends, and tried to convince herself that what happened in the elevator was just a delirium caused by stress and fatigue. However, the images of shadowy figures and ominous whispers continued to haunt her. One night, while Sarah was alone in her apartment, she heard a sound coming from the elevator. It was the sound of doors opening and closing, as if someone was using the elevator in the middle of the night. She got up and went to the elevator door, curious to see who could be down there. When the doors opened, the hallway was dark and empty. There was no one down there, but the elevator was moving on its own, going up and down without stopping. Sarah looked at the panel of buttons and saw that none of them were being pressed. The elevator continued to move, as if it had a life of its own. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine and retreated back to her apartment, slamming the elevator door shut. She knew something was wrong, that the nightmare wasn't over yet. In the days that followed, the elevator continued to act strangely. Sometimes the doors would open and close on their own. Sarah tried to explain this to the building manager, but he found no mechanical failure in the elevator. The nightmare was unfolding before his eyes. Sarah knew she couldn't ignore the strange events that were occurring. She felt like the elevator was trying to communicate with her in some way, as if it was trying to tell her a dark secret. One night, while Sarah was alone in her apartment, she again heard the sound of the elevator doors opening. She approached cautiously and saw that the elevator was stopped on the ground floor, with the doors open. She hesitated for a moment, but something compelled her to enter. The elevator doors closed behind her, and she pressed the button for the ground floor, as if she were being guided by an invisible force. The elevator began to move, slowly descending into the depths of the building. As the elevator descended, the lights began to flicker, and the sinister laughter she had heard earlier echoed inside the elevator. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the elevator continued its descent. Finally, the elevator stopped, and the doors opened to reveal a macabre scene. Sarah was back in the narrow, dark hallway, lit only by the candles in the iron holders. The shadowy figures were there, waiting for her, their empty eyes staring at her. This time, there was no escape. Sarah was trapped in the elevator nightmare once again, at the mercy of the shadows and ominous whispers that surrounded her. She knew that the elevator had brought her back to this dark place to reveal her secret, but she didn't know what to expect. The shadowy figures approached, their whispering murmurs becoming clearer and clearer. Sarah felt an indescribable sense of terror, knowing she was about to discover the truth behind this entire nightmare. The elevator began moving again, rising quickly away from the shadowy hallway. Sarah had no control over her direction. She looked up at the shadowy figures as the elevator took her to some unknown place, and her scream of horror echoed in the empty hallway as she disappeared into the depths of the elevator's nightmare.